Okay. All right. So today we have Dr. Sarah Borsetti, who is a commercial fisheries specialist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And she has been working a lot with the commercial fishing industry, and her research recently has had a component to it that is focused on looking at the effects of offshore wind energy development on the Atlantic Surfclam fishery. She's also looking at wind energy development on the Atlantic scallop fishery. Sarah received her PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University and worked for a while at the Haskin Shellfish Research Lab before she took her position that she now has at VIMS. What she's going to talk to us about today is a really interesting implication of setting off parts of the continental shelf for wind farm development, in that it has a potential effect on the ability to survey stocks, because, and Sarah will talk about this in her presentation, but it has a potential effect on our ability to assess the stock biomass that's on the continental shelf. So the title of our seminar today is Potential Repercussions of Offshore Wind Energy Development on Scientific Surveys and Population Assessment. And the case study that she's looking at is the Atlantic Surfclam fishery. So Sarah, please go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Eileen. Can you hear me okay?
You're good.
Perfect. Yep. Okay. So as Eileen introduced, I am Sarah Borsetti, and I am at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So over the last few years, I have been working with several colleagues to examine the potential repercussions of offshore wind energy development on the Atlantic surfclam fishery. So those researchers include our project lead, Dr. Daphne Monroe, who is a shellfish ecologist at Rutgers University, Dr. Andrew Sheld, who's a resource economist at VIMS, and his postdoc, Dr. Jennifer Beckensteiner, Dr. Eric Powell, another shellfish ecologist at the University of Southern Mississippi, and ODU's very own oceanographers, Dr. John Klink and Dr. Eileen Hoffman. So this project was funded by BOEM, and I've also included some of our industry collaborators on this slide who have been very instrumental to this work. And so I'm going to talk about the potential repercussions of offshore wind development on the Atlantic surfclam fishery. So I'm going to go a little bit broader to start and then get into some of the impacts on the surfclam survey itself, as Eileen mentioned. So here is the project's QR code. So if you're interested in finding any of the publications or reports from this work, you can take a picture of that, or that will also be found on the last slide. So first, to give you some context regarding offshore wind globally, I want to highlight that over the past 20 years, offshore wind energy has gotten a head start outside of the US. So in the figure on the left, you can see the cumulative offshore wind energy capacity by country in different colors. And in total, there's about 50 gigawatts of global capacity. The countries that are really leading this effort is the UK, Denmark, Germany, and more recently, China. And this lighter shading here shows projected deployment by country. So there'll be over 177,000 megawatts by 2027 that have been just announced in this period. So as you can see, I think the US shows up somewhere down here in the purple, and we're a very small blip compared to the global capacity of offshore wind. In the US, offshore wind is a new industry. Currently, there are only two small pilot projects, one off of Rhode Island and one off of Virginia. However, the Biden administration has set national targets of 30 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by 2030, and more recently has included floating capacity in the nation's goals. So to reach these targets, there have been several auctions for renewable energy leases, and it's approximately 2.4 million acres currently have been proposed for offshore wind infrastructure. And there's about 4 million acres that are under consideration for potential offshore wind leasing. One very important thing to note is these numbers are likely already out of date. This is a constantly changing landscape, but I'm showing you some of these numbers just to give you a scale of how big this industry could possibly be. So here you can see the locations of the US offshore wind leases and future leases, and this is as of May 2022. So here in the North Atlantic, the green areas are where there are lease areas, and these already have been auctioned off to developers, and they're at different stages in the development timeline. Whereas in the other areas, you can see red areas, and these red areas are called call areas, so they're precursor to lease areas, and their boundaries are more likely to change. But the take home is that once all of this offshore wind is built out, the continental shelf is going to be very different. And this changing landscape will likely impact current users that operate in these areas. And thinking of those users, that includes commercial fishing industries, which operate heavily in some of these areas in the North Atlantic. So focusing more on this East Coast, this region is home to some of the most economically important fisheries in the US, and there is substantial overlap between these fish populations and lease areas for wind farm. And this has the potential to lead to some fishing vulnerability, whether through effort displacement or exclusion. So currently, as it stands, fishing in the US is not legally excluded from these offshore wind lease areas, whereas it is in some other countries. But some believe that some of these areas may become de facto exclusion areas because some fleets may not be able to access resources within these areas. And these restrictions could be due to operational risks. So for instance, some safety concerns of maybe maneuvering fishing vessels in between these turbines, or maybe using gear in these turbine arrays. So one potential gear conflict is the Atlantic Surfclam fishery dredge. So here is this massive dredge you see here in the picture on the left. And this dredge pumps water down into the sediment, fluidizes the sediment so that the gear can access buried clams. And there have been some that have expressed concern of using this gear over top of some of these cable arrays. So these cable arrays are going to be buried down to a certain depth, but there's still some concern about using this gear over top of those cables. So the surfclam fishery has actually been identified as one of the most exposed to offshore wind due to where it harvests in the along the East Coast, where the ports are, and this gear that's used. So this Atlantic surfclam fishery is a major fishery on the East Coast. It spans from Georges Bank through the Mid-Atlantic, and it has a history of a long-term history of effective management. It's got effectively no bycatch. It has its MSC certification, but in 2019, $2.3 million of landed catch in this fishery was caught in areas that are now leased for offshore wind. So this offshore wind energy is likely to impact how this fishery operates, but to the extent of this impact is still unknown. So ways that offshore wind could impact this fishery include how the vessels move to and from fishing ground, where effort is aggregated in, the number of trips could potentially change, and also there could be some shoreside changes from this shift in effort. So in trying to answer how some of these changes could occur, we used a model to simulate the Surfclam stock and fishery, and then we wanted to see how this modeled fishery would respond to different offshore wind development scenarios. So to do that, the team I mentioned earlier used the Spatially Explicit Fisheries Economic Simulator, or CEFIS. So the CEFIS modeling framework consists of linked modules that simulate the Atlantic surfclam biomass, fishing behavior, which includes how captains' memories, communication, how captains search, and the fishing fleet. So various fishing characteristics, how the vessels move. Additionally, there is an economic component in CEFIS, which is used to simulate revenues and costs for fishing vessels and processors. And the fishing industry and processors worked collaboratively with our team to ensure that we were capturing the correct fishing behaviors of the captains and vessels, and also the industry economics. Something else to note is that this model has a management submodel. So in this model, there's a survey that goes out every year, and this survey data goes into a stock assessment calculation, like the one that's used in the actual fishery to get stock status calculations. So here you can see the model domain. So it's configured using a grid of 10 minutes of latitude by 10 minutes of longitude. So I'll call this 10-minute squares. And they range from Georges Bank down to Chesapeake Bay. And on this model domain, you can see land in brown, and then the biological domain here in white. In the model, there's 4 ports. So you can see the list of those ports here. And then offshore wind leases in this model are classified in 2 different ways. So you'll see these darker ones here. Those are what I'll call existing leases. And then we've also got another classification of leases, and those are areas that are potential or future leases. And you can see those here. And so the 10-minute squares were assigned as wind energy squares if the lease polygons overlapped with 50% or more of the 10-minute squares. So you can see what 10-minute squares were defined as offshore wind lease squares. You can see that in the orange there. So we've got our current leases in dark gray and our future leases in lighter gray. So a smaller footprint and then a larger footprint with all the leases. So the first thing that was done was this model was validated to ensure it was functioning like reality. So fishing independent and dependent information was used to verify the simulated fishing behavior and catch. So on the left in each one of these figures, you can see the actual real data compared to the model data for a variety of different metrics. And you can see that our model was performing well. So here is a number of metrics that we looked at for this model. So we were looking at fishery and economic metrics, things like biomass catch, landings per unit effort, how long boats were at sea, how long they were fishing for, and the economics were broken down by fleet and processors. So things like total revenue, total cost, average cost, fuel cost, transportation cost. So these were the things we were comparing in these different model simulations I'll talk about in a few slides. So the rest of the talk will be broken down into 3 sections. First, I'll talk about the cumulative economic impacts, quickly talk about the regional economic impacts, and then I'll get into how offshore wind could potentially impact the stock assessment survey. So to start with the cumulative impacts, we wanted to examine how the economic response of the surfclam, how the economics of the surfclam fishery would respond under different offshore wind development scenarios. So the first scenario we ran was business as usual. We allowed the fishery to operate with no restrictions. So the vessels would go out, fish wherever they wanted. And then the first restriction scenario was we allowed vessels to transit through these wind energy areas, but we didn't allow them to fish inside of them. So no fishing was occurring on the orange squares. And then the second restriction scenario was we didn't allow transit in these lease areas or fishing. And so both of these restrictions were done for current leases. So the smaller footprint in dark gray, and then for current and future leases. So this larger footprint of all the leases. And so you'll see the results arranged in this manner, looking at our first restriction, our second restriction for both the smaller and larger footprint. So I just want to give a little bit more background on the model before we get into some of the key findings. So the CEPHIS model is an agent-based model, which means there are agents in the model that are assigned certain attributes. So the active agents in the CEPHIS models are the captains and the fishing vessels. So there are 33 different vessels in this model. So they range in different sizes. They match the actual vessels that are in the fleet and the fishery. And then these vessels are controlled by captains, and each one of these captains have specific characteristics. So there's 12 different captain types. So things like the captains have different memory, they have different levels of communication, and also different searching skills. And this helps determine where and how efficiently the captains actually fish for surf clams. And so there's some variability in this model. This comes from these variations in the captain's behaviors. Captains are randomly assigned to different vessels, so that introduces some variability in decision-making. There are also weather restrictions in this model. So weather controls fishing by certain vessels some of the larger vessels are able to fish in different conditions than the smaller vessels. So that weather restriction is mostly based on wind speed. And then there is recruitment variability also in this model. So the recruitment variability was introduced by applying a random factor to the total number of recruits. So recruitment is assumed to be everywhere in the model, which is consistent with what we see with observations and also with larval transport modeling. And then there is a spatially varying mortality rates in this model. So this constrains the fishable biomass to where we actually observe the fishable biomass in the real stock assessment. So in this model, we ran 5 different scenarios. So each one of these 5 scenarios are what I showed on that last slide with the map. And we'll go into these on the results slide again. But these 5 scenarios were simulated to assess the economic condition of the surf clam fishery with or without constraints imposed by the lease areas. So each one of these 5 scenarios, there was 200 simulations that occurred, and each simulation was run for 300 years. So thinking of one of these scenarios, there was, in the first 100 years, we didn't allow fishing. So we allowed the surf clam population to stabilize. Fishing was enabled in that second 100 years, and the stock was fished to equilibrium. And then in the last 100 years, whatever that specific scenario's restrictions were of offshore wind were imposed. So that was either imposed on fishing or on the fishing vessel's transit. And then what we did was use the last 50 years of the simulation to assess the economic impacts of the wind energy scenario on the surf clam fishery. So this 50 years of simulations was not used to project 50 years into the future, but rather it's a 50-year window that provides us a large set of impact estimates that give us information on short to medium term effects. So getting into some of the results we found that imposing some of these restrictions, so if you remember, here are the restrictions. We have our status quo, which is business as usual. We have no fishing in transit for the smaller current wind farms, and then the full footprint. So what we saw was with increasing restrictions, we saw an increase in time at sea, and the number of trips was reduced. The number of trips taken by the fleet was reduced, and we saw a increase in costs. So those costs include fuel costs and processor costs. So on this figure on the left, you see the different restriction scenarios as I described, and this is for the fleet revenue. So we see a decrease in fleet revenue and an increase in average cost with increasing restrictions. However, certain ports in this Surfclam fishery we found were more impacted with some of these restrictions than others. So this is a similar figures to the ones we saw on the last slide, with fleet revenues on the top, average costs on the bottom. But on the left, we see Atlantic City, the port of Atlantic City, and on the right, New Bedford. And so what we see is the average costs in Atlantic City increase by about 10%, and that revenue for Atlantic City decreases by 25%. But we don't see those same impacts in the New Bedford fleet. So this led us to further examine the regional impact of offshore wind on the Surfclam fishery. So we reran this model to look at the regional economic response of the fishery under these different wind energy development scenarios. Once again, we had our status quo where we allowed fishing in transit, so the vessels could operate like normal. And then our first restriction, just like the last cumulative impacts, was we didn't allow vessels to transit the areas. We allowed vessels to transit, we didn't allow fishing. And then the second one was we didn't allow transit or fishing. And once again, we did that for the current leases, those in the darker gray, and the current and future leases. So we looked at the smaller footprint and the larger footprint for both of these restriction scenarios. And here are some of the changes in the biology and fishing behavior for these regional scenarios. So how these figures are arranged are from south, Delmarva in blue, to north, Massachusetts, Rhode Island in orange. And you'll see here, this is, each bar is the percent change of that scenario as compared to the status quo. So once again, we've got no fishing and transit for the smaller footprint, those in dark gray, and then for the larger footprint, all of the leases. And once again, we see New Jersey really stands out. There is the greatest, so we see the catch decline, depending on which scenario you're looking at, from 3 to 14%, and then time at sea increases. Similarly, looking at the economic response, once again, New Jersey really stands out when you're looking at the different regions. So costs increase, and we see a decrease in profits. So now moving on to the Surfclam stock assessment, stock survey impacts. So as I mentioned before, there is a management component of CEPHIS, and it's underpinned by the Federal Scientific Survey, which is conducted annually. And this survey determines the size and distribution of the Atlantic surfclam population. The survey is based on tows distributed throughout the Atlantic surfclam throughout the stock, and the assessment is a stratified random design, and tows are allocated to each survey strata, and there's about 150 stations per strata, and you can see all those different strata colored here on the map in the left. This survey is performed on an industry vessel, so you can see that vessel here. So it's anticipated that the survey will be unable to perform survey tows within the wind energy areas. So basically, we're making the same assumption. The survey vessel is one of the commercial vessels. So if fishing can't occur there on that vessel, likely the survey effort won't be able to occur there. So we tried to evaluate the impact of excluding the wind energy areas from the federal assessment survey on the Surfclam population biomass assessment. So here, two scenarios were simulated, very similar to the past scenarios I described. The first one was excluding the survey vessel operations and fishing in current wind lease areas, so those in dark gray, the current leases. And then the second one was excluding survey vessel operations and fishing in the current and future leases. So the first one is looking at that smaller footprint, and then the second one is looking at this entire footprint. And so the first thing we did was look at how biomass changed, and to do that, we calculated the percent change in biomass for both of those simulations, the current leases and current and future leases. And we compared those to the reference simulation. So the reference simulation was that status quo simulation. And that allowed us to scale apply those percent changes and figure out how much the observed spawning stock biomass changed compared to the recent assessment. So those percent changes were then applied to the observed spawning stock biomass. And that adjusted spawning stock biomass showed us the simulated loss in biomass. Then we looked at fishing mortality. So we did that for both simulations, the smaller and the larger footprint. And that was calculated, the fishing mortality is calculated as catch over biomass. And so the fishing mortality was similarly adjusted as the biomass. And we looked at that for both of those scenarios. And so on the figure on the left, you can see the mean fishable biomass of the Atlantic surf clam estimated from the Cephas reference simulation. That's this one here. And that's the simulation with unrestricted access. And then this is the smaller footprint and the largest footprint with existing and future leases. So excluding fishing from the wind energy area displaced this fishing from these two areas, and we see an increase in biomass. So this model tells us that we're not really seeing these wind energy areas function like marine protected areas as some think that they might. This increase in biomass excluding fishing really doesn't impact the population biomass as much as maybe some would have originally thought, only about a 1.2% increase in biomass. And when we looked at the percent change in biomass, we saw a 17% decrease in the spawning stock biomass in the most restricted scenario. And that's because that spawning stock biomass becomes inaccessible to the survey and is effectively removed from the fishery. So in this figure here, we're looking at one of the biological reference points. So biological reference points are indicators that serve as metrics of the stock status. So they're used to figure out how much you can safely harvest. So the idea is we want these bars to be above the targets and nowhere near the threshold. And so what you can see here is the ratio of that adjusted spawning stock biomass I talked about over the spawning stock threshold. So this is from the actual stock assessment. And you can see that when we exclude the existing and future lease areas, this spawning stock biomass is about 1.6% below the target. So that's getting pretty close to that target line. And these changes in the biological reference points are driven, once again, because we're unable to access the Surfclam biomass within these lease areas. And so the changes to these survey procedures or interruptions to these long-term survey time series can increase uncertainty in our biomass estimates. And that's really important because those are used in setting fisheries quota. Additionally, increases in some of this uncertainty increases the precautionary buffers that are used when setting annual catch limits. And this could, in turn, impact some of the annual quotas. When looking at fishing mortality, reminder, fishing mortality is that catch over biomass. So when we look at the percent change, we see an increase of 0.7% increase when we look at existing leases and about 7% when we look at that larger footprint with existing and future leases. So again, we're looking at like another biological reference point. So we see that adjusted fishing mortality over that F threshold. So we're seeing that that ratio increases, but in neither of these simulated conditions is overfishing occurring. So both of these remain well below the overfishing threshold. And changes in these biological reference points, both fishing mortality and the spawning stock biomass, are really driven by the inability to access that biomass in these wind energy areas leases. And the take-home point is that can have repercussions for the management of this resource. And so some conclusions are that the fishing sector impacts really depend on where these wind energy areas are, the scale of them, so how big they actually are, and how the vessels actually change, how vessel operations actually change. What we did find was that the Southern Surfclam fleet incurs the greatest impact, and that impacts can extend beyond the fleet to the processing sector. And those last few slides, we saw an interactive effect of survey access, and the fishing fleet could lead to increased uncertainty in the stock status. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. I have left plenty of time for discussion. I'd like to thank all the students that have worked on this project in some capacity, Mauricio, Stephanie, and Molly, the industry advisory panel, the industry advisory board, and the management advisory board. Without the knowledge from the industry, this model wouldn't be able to function as well as it does. So we really appreciate working collaboratively with the industry. As I mentioned, here is the QR code for the project. And with that, I can take any questions and